What happens when the most feared man in Montreal finds the one woman his broken little girl will actually let hold her, and she's a round-faced, soft-armed cafeteria cook who just needed to keep the lights on? Daphne Okafor had never set foot in Westmount in her life. She knew it existed the way most people in her neighborhood knew Paris existed. Beautiful, distant, and built for someone else entirely, lived in a walk-up on Rue Beaubien, with a radiator that clanged like it was angry at her, and a landlord who slid notices under the door the way other people slid birthday cards. Cheerfully, frequently, without apology. He was 26 years old, 5'3", and 262 pounds on a good day. Not that she weighed herself on good days anymore. She'd stopped doing that around the time her mother got sick, and there were too many other numbers to keep track of. The hydro bill, the pharmacy copay. The balance on the line of credit she'd opened to cover the gap between what palliative care cost and what her mother's insurance would touch. Her mother had passed 8 months ago, in March, just as the snow was starting to melt. Daphne had held her hand through the last night, and then gone directly to her morning shift at the hospital cafeteria, because she couldn't afford to call in. Made scrambled eggs for 400 people, with her eyes so dry they felt like sandpaper, and nobody had noticed anything was wrong, and she had told herself that was fine. That invisible was fine. It was not fine. The debt her mother left behind was not fine either, not the medical kind that she could navigate slowly with a payment plan and a lot of anxiety. It was the other kind, the kind her mother had never mentioned until Daphne found the papers in a shoebox in the back of the closet. Her mother had borrowed money years ago from a man named Gilles Sauvé, who ran a loan operation out of a dry cleaning shop on Rue Saint-Denis that had never, as far as Daphne could tell, cleaned a single garment. With compound interest applied generously and without mercy, the debt had become a number that Daphne could not look at directly, the way you couldn't look directly at the sun. Gilles had given her 6 months. He'd been almost polite about it, which somehow made it worse. She was 3 weeks from the deadline when the call came. It was from an agency she'd registered with 6 months earlier, mostly out of desperation. A domestic placement service that handled private household staff for clients who paid in cash and expected discretion. Daphne had listed her experience. Cooking, cleaning, childcare, light administrative work. She'd spent 2 summers as a camp counselor in the Laurentians during university before she'd had to drop out. She knew how to handle children. She was good at it in the unflashy way that didn't get you noticed until it was desperately needed. The woman from the agency called her Daphne exactly once, and then never again, as though the name itself was too familiar for the conversation she was about to have. "The placement is in Westmount," she said. "The client is private. Very private. The position is residential. You'd live on the property. The pay is 5 times our standard rate weekly in cash." Daphne's hand tightened on the phone. "Child," the woman continued. "A daughter, 4 years old. She hasn't spoken since her mother's accident 14 months ago. Hasn't let anyone touch her. They've gone through 7 caregivers. The last one lasted 4 days. And before that, 2. What happened to them?" The woman paused in a way that communicated a great deal without saying anything. "The child is expressive. The client needs someone who won't be frightened easily. Someone steady." "I'm steady," Daphne said. There was a longer pause. "The client is," she chose her words with care, "not a conventional employer. His household operates under certain rules. You'd be required to sign an NDA before the first interview. You'd be transported to the property, not given an address in advance." Daphne thought about Gilles Sauvé. She thought about the shoebox. She thought about the number she couldn't look at. "When do I start?" she said. The car that came for her was black and long and had windows she couldn't see through from the outside. The driver didn't introduce himself. He held the door open with the practiced blankness of a man who had learned that strangers in the back of that car did not want small talk, and Daphne was grateful for it. Sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched Montreal slide past the tinted glass. Her Montreal, the dépanneurs and the spiral staircases, and the graffiti murals she'd walked past 1,000 times. And then it receded, and the city became a different version of itself, quieter and larger, the kind of neighborhood where the houses sat far back from the road, as though they didn't want to be looked at. The estate was behind a stone wall, a gate, and the gate opened before the car had fully stopped, and Daphne noted the cameras and understood something about the man she was going to meet, before she'd ever seen his face. The house itself was enormous and grey, and built to last longer than everyone currently living in it. It was led inside by a man who didn't give his name. She would later learn it was Armand, through a hallway with flagstone floors and oil paintings that were old enough to be in a museum, and almost certainly had been at some point before arriving here. She was brought to a study and told to wait. She waited. Rémi Caron walked into the room like weather, not like a man entering a space, but like a pressure change, the kind that made your ears pop. It was somewhere past 40, with silver threaded through dark hair. He wore short, and a face that had been handsome once, and had become something more severe than handsome through the accumulation of years and decisions. He had the kind of stillness that didn't come from calm. It came from absolute certainty that nothing in the room would move faster than he permitted. He looked at Daphne the way she imagined he looked at balance sheets. Quickly, completely, without warmth. She wasn't small, knew she wasn't small. She felt it acutely in that room, in that chair, under that gaze. The fullness of her, the way her thighs pressed against the arms of the chair, the way her coat pulled at the shoulders when she straightened her spine. She straightened it anyway. "You're younger than I expected," he said. His English was perfect, faintly accented, the French underneath it like bedrock. Nancy said, "You needed someone steady," Daphne said. "Age is not the same thing as steady," and studied her. Most people looked away from Rémi Caron when he studied them. She'd been told this later by Armand, who'd watched the whole thing from the doorway. She didn't look away. "My daughter," he said, "is 4 years old. Her name is Cléa. Since the accident that killed her mother, she has not spoken. She has screamed. She has thrown objects. She has bitten 2 of her caregivers and put a 3rd one in genuine distress. She does not permit touch, does not permit proximity. It's in her room, and she rocks, and she stares at nothing. And every specialist I have brought to this house has told me something different, and none of it has worked." All of this, in the same flat tone he might have used to describe a failing investment. But his jaw was tight, in a way that told Daphne the flatness was costing him something. "Yeah, what makes you believe you can manage what 7 trained professionals could not?" "I don't manage children," Daphne said. I sit with them. I let them come to me. I'm not fast, and I'm not frightening, and I don't have anywhere better to be." Something moved in his expression, not softness, more like a tension sharpening. "You'll sign the NDA before you leave today," he said, "if you're willing to proceed. The terms of employment are residential, meaning you live here. You do not discuss this household. You do not carry a personal phone with external service. You'll be provided with one. You will be compensated generously and treated with respect. If my daughter does not accept your presence within 72 hours, the arrangement ends and you'll be paid regardless for your time." He stood, straightening his cuffs. Daphne noticed his hands large, scarred across the knuckles in the way hands get scarred when they've been used, really used, in ways that don't show up in any formal employment record. "Do you understand what I do?" he asked. "And not what I tell people I do, Daphne, what I actually do." Daphne thought for a moment. "I think so," she said. "And you're still sitting there." "I need this job," she said honestly. "And I think your daughter needs someone who won't leave." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the way men like him nodded when they'd made a decision they intended to keep. Cléa's room was at the end of a long hallway on the 2nd floor. One had tried very hard to make it beautiful. There were soft rugs in yellow and cream, a canopy bed with gauze curtains, shelves of toys, arranged with a care that had the fingerprints of grief all over it. A father who didn't know what his daughter needed, but was buying everything he could think of just in case. The little girl was in the corner, behind the reading chair. She had her knees pulled up to her chest and her dark eyes fixed on the window, and she didn't look at Daphne when Daphne came in. She didn't look at anything that was in the room. Daphne didn't try to approach her. She didn't crouch down, or use a soft voice, or say hello in the careful way people said hello to children they were frightened of. Just walked to the center of the rug, sat down cross-legged, not without effort, and she didn't try to pretend it was effortless, and opened the bag she'd brought with her from home. She had butter tarts in a plastic container, made them 2 days before, the way her mother had taught her. Her grandmother's recipe, the filling a little runny, the way it was supposed to be, the pastry thick enough to hold everything together. She set the container on the rug and opened. She didn't offer one to Cléa. She just started eating one herself, slowly, looking at the window the same way Cléa was looking at it. She sat there for 40 minutes. Cléa didn't move, didn't look at her, didn't touch the tarts. Daphne came back the next morning. She sat in the same spot. She brought the same container, still half full, empty. On the afternoon of the second day, she was sitting on the rug with a worn paperback she'd found in the estate's library, a battered copy of Anne of Green Gables, which felt right for reasons she couldn't fully explain, reading quietly to no one in particular, not performing it, just reading the way she would have read to herself. She heard a small sound. She didn't look up. She kept reading, her voice steady and low. 12 minutes later, she felt a small weight against her side. Gaia. Cléa had crossed the room without making a sound and pressed herself against Daphne's arm. Not quite leaning, not quite holding, just existing in contact. Her small body was rigid at first, every muscle braced for something terrible. Daphne kept reading. She didn't put her arm around the child. She didn't shift or adjust. She just let herself be warm and solid and present, and slowly, over the course of 3 pages, she felt the rigidity drain out of Cléa's small frame. Didn't know how long they sat like that. Long enough for the light in the room to change. When she finally looked down, Cléa was asleep against her, one small fist curled into the fabric of Daphne's sleeve. She found out later that Rémi had been standing in the doorway for over 20 minutes, that Armand had had to physically put a hand on his arm to stop him from coming in, and that the man who controlled half the port authority of the city of Montreal had stood in a hallway outside his daughter's room and cried without making a sound, because his child, who hadn't voluntarily touched another human being in over a year, was asleep against a stranger's arm like she'd found something she'd been looking for. Living in the Romano estate, in Rémi's estate, she corrected herself every time the familiar shorthand from her own thoughts leaked in, was strange in the way that dreams were strange. Not nightmarish, just slightly outside the rules of ordinary life. The household staff were professional to the point of opacity, learned names slowly. Armand, who handled everything Rémi didn't specify, which turned out to be nearly everything. A woman named Josette, who managed the kitchen with the seriousness of a general commanding a campaign. New men who stood at the outer gate, whose names Daphne never learned, but who, after the first week, nodded at her, with the particular gravity of people who had decided you were worth acknowledging, and settled into a routine that organized itself around Cléa. Mornings, she made breakfast in the small kitchen off the east corridor that Josette had ceded to her without comment, the tacit understanding being that whatever Daphne made seemed to be the only thing Cléa would eat reliably. She read to her in the afternoons. She took her into the garden when the October weather permitted, just walking, not directing, letting the child lead at whatever pace she chose. Cléa had still not spoken. He had begun to follow Daphne from room to room, and once when Daphne had crouched to pick up a toy that had rolled under the dresser, she'd felt small hands pressed flat against her back, steadying her the way you'd steady someone you'd decided to take care of. Rémi Caron's existed in the household like a planet, large, gravitational, mostly distant. He left early and returned late. And when he was home, there were always other men, always voices behind closed doors, always the particular quality of tension that lived in rooms where serious things were decided. He checked on Cléa every night after he returned, regardless of the hour, and Daphne knew this because she heard his footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, pausing at the door. He found her in the kitchen at 11 o'clock one Wednesday night, 3 weeks into her employment. She was making poutine, not the tourist kind, real poutine, with proper cheese curds. She'd had Armand sauce from a fromagerie on the South Shore, because Cléa had pointed at a picture of it in a magazine that afternoon with an expression of intense focus that Daphne had interpreted as a request. Yemi stood in the kitchen doorway in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking like a man who had had a long day and couldn't quite locate the end of it. "It's late," he said, pointed at the cheese curds. Cléa asked, she said. In her way, he came closer, leaning against the counter with the careful posture of a man who was very tired and trying not to show it. He watched her work for a moment. She was aware of the disproportion of it. Her, wide-hipped and soft-armed in a kitchen apron that she'd had to retie to actually fit, him tall and precise next to her. She'd spent her whole life being aware of exactly this kind of disproportion. Space. In his kitchen, inexplicably, it did not. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. "I'm aware." "Cléa drew a picture today," he said. "Armand told me." He said it was. He paused. "The first one she's done since before the accident. It was a dog," Daphne said. "She called it. She pointed at it, and she made a sound. It wasn't quite a word, but it was trying to be one." She heard him exhale slowly beside her. "What do I owe you?" he said, quietly. "And I don't mean the weekly payment, I mean." "What do I owe you for whatever it is you're doing?" "You don't owe me anything," Daphne said. She turned to look at him because it felt dishonest not to. "I like her. I liked her from the first day, when she was sitting behind that chair like a small creature waiting for a storm to pass. She reminded me of someone I used to know." "Who?" "Me," Daphne said simply, and I didn't understand yet that it eventually stopped. "Yeah." Rémi was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up a cheese curd from the container on the counter and ate it without ceremony, which was so unexpected that Daphne nearly laughed. "That's very good," he said. "I know," she said. Threat came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. His name was Gilles Sauvé. Of course it was. She'd assumed, she'd told herself, "You're the way you tell yourself comfortable things when the alternative is unbearable." That her old life was far enough behind her now, that the debt was a problem she was solving weekly, with the cash she was accumulating in an envelope in her dresser drawer, that she had bought herself time. She hadn't bought nearly enough. It was Armand who intercepted the first approach. A man who'd been asking questions in her old neighborhood, showing her photograph, tracing the thread from the cafeteria to the agency, to, yet, the general vicinity of the estate. Armand brought this to Rémi's attention without telling Daphne, and for 4 days she was watched by people she didn't know she was being watched by, while the household quietly mapped the shape of a problem she didn't yet know she had. She found out on a Thursday afternoon when she came back from the garden with Cléa and found Rémi waiting in the corridor. And the expression on his face was not the one he usually wore. It was controlled. It was the face of a man applying tremendous pressure to something that wanted to come apart. Armand showed her inside with Cléa. She heard him engaging the child with the gentle distraction he'd developed over the past weeks. He was quite good at it by now. And Rémi brought Daphne into his study and closed the door. He knew. She could see it. She didn't insult him by pretending otherwise. She told him everything. Her mother, the shoebox, Gilles Sauvé, and his dry cleaning shop on Saint-Denis, and the number she'd never been able to look at directly. She told him how she'd come to the agency, not because she was qualified, exactly, but because she was desperate, and what desperate looks like when it puts on its best coat and tries to seem like a choice, and told him that the debt was almost cleared. 3 more weeks, maybe 4, and that she hadn't told anyone because she hadn't thought it was relevant. She hadn't thought anyone would look for her here. She hadn't thought. She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs the way she did when she was trying not to cry in front of people who didn't deserve to see it. "I was going to handle it," she said. "I am handling it." Rémi had been sitting across from her, very still in the way he was still when something had his complete attention. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Sauve's people left a message at your old address. A message with your photograph in it. She felt cold. He was going to use you, Rémi said, not as a debtor, as leverage. Someone in his circle apparently understands what it means that you're in this house, near this family, near Cléa. Daphne looked at him. I would never, she started. I know, he said. It wasn't gentle exactly. It was certain, which was better. She felt the full weight of the situation settle around her then. The scope of the mistake she'd made, the naivety of it, the way she'd thought that one good thing, one good job, one child who needed her, could exist in clean isolation from everything else. The way good things almost never did. I'll leave, she said. I should leave. If I'm gone, there's no leverage, there's no... Rémi stood. He wasn't a man who crossed rooms quickly to make a point, and so the fact that he crossed the room quickly to stand in front of her registered as something. He looked down at her. She was still sitting, and he was tall, and his expression had something in it she hadn't seen before. You are not leaving this house, he said, and then, more quietly, Cléa spoke this morning. When she woke up and you weren't there yet, she called for you. He went very still. She said your name. He said Daph. Said Daph. It was the first word she said in 14 months. She felt the tears come and didn't try to stop them. They came the way things did after you'd been holding them back for so long that the structural effort of holding them became more than you could maintain. Her mother, the shoebox, the cafeteria and the scrambled eggs at dawn, and the radiator on Rue Beaubien, and the debt she'd carried alone because there was no one to share it with, all came out of her, in the sitting room of a mansion she'd never imagined being in front of the most dangerous man she'd ever met. Rémi sat down on the low table in front of her chair, directly in front of her, close, and handed her the pocket square from his breast pocket. It was the kind of gesture that didn't fit a man like him, and that was exactly why it undid her. You are not a problem I'm solving, he said. You are the only person in 14 months who has given my daughter back to me. Nobody touches you. You understand me? Nobody. Gilles Sauvé had made the particular error of people who operated comfortably in small, dark corners. He had misjudged what he was adjacent to. A debtor, a woman, a body that soft women and desperate people were treated by small men as leverage to be pulled. And he had not understood that the house she worked in had walls that existed for reasons older and more serious than privacy. Rémi did not tell Daphne the details of how it was resolved. He told her it was resolved on a Friday evening when he came home earlier than usual. Been in the kitchen making split pea soup. It had turned cold, a real November cold, the kind that settled into Montreal like it planned to stay, and he'd come and stood in the kitchen doorway the same way he had those weeks ago, and she'd known by his face that it was over. The debt is cleared, he said. All of it. Daphne set down her spoon. She turned around. Started to say that he hadn't needed to, that she would have managed, and he stopped her, not rudely, just with the quiet weight of someone who had already decided and didn't require the argument. You've been carrying it alone since your mother died, he said. You shouldn't have had to, and what Sauvé turned it into, what he made it, that's not a debt. That's a debt that got used as a weapon, and weapons don't get repaid, they get removed. She looked at him for a long time, looked back at her in the same way, without deflection, without the careful social performance of pretending not to see her fully. She was aware, standing in his kitchen in her apron, of everything she was and wasn't, the size of her, the roundness of her, the fact that she was someone who made butter tarts from her grandmother's recipe and cried in front of dangerous men and read Anne of Green Gables to traumatized 4-year-olds. Until they fell asleep against her arm. You waited for some part of herself to feel insufficient. It didn't come. Rémi crossed the kitchen. He stopped close enough that she had to look up at him. Sir. And he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that sat completely at odds with every known fact about him, and she decided that maybe known facts were only part of a story. It wasn't a maid who'd wandered into the wrong world. She wasn't a body that had taken up too much of the wrong space. It was Daphne Okafor, 26 years old, who had held a broken child and hadn't let go, and who was now being held in return, in a kitchen that smelled like split pea soup and something warmer, by a man who looked at her the way her mother had always told her she deserved to be looked at before she'd stopped believing that. The soup needed another 20 minutes. Cléa was asleep upstairs. Armand was somewhere doing whatever Armand always did. Outside, the Montreal winter pressed cold against the windows and didn't get in. In the months that followed, the estate changed in the way places change when something living takes root in them. The hallways had noise in them now, small footsteps, the particular high-pitched joy of a 4-year-old who had remembered that her voice existed and was making up for lost time. She had words, and then sentences, and then an opinion about everything, delivered with the serious authority of someone who had thought about it deeply before speaking. She called Daphne, always, Daph. She called her father Papa, which she had called him before, but she said it differently now, with expectation in it, like someone who had decided it was safe to expect things again. Daphne remained. That was the simplest way to put it. Remained the way good things remain when they've been allowed to, not dramatically, not as a declaration, but as the slow accumulation of ordinary mornings and the particular shape a life takes when it finds the place it fits. She was not a fairy tale. She was a woman who made excellent poutine and extremely good butter tarts, and who had carried too much alone for too long, and who had found in a grey stone house in Westmount a child who needed the specific things she had to offer, and a man who looked at her like she was exactly right, every warm and solid inch of her without exception. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.